Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of The Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, in the first topic, we are going to understand what do we mean by the new collective quantified goals which were actually in the limelight at COP29 of UNFCCC concluded recently at Baku, Azerbaijan. Then in the second topic, we'll try to understand that how the production-linked incentive scheme of the government of India has fared in the last 3 years by providing data analysis related to it. Then from your simplified section, we'll be taking up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide the much important value addition and practice question keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2025. So stay tuned. The editorial today highlights the challenges which are associated with the new collective quantified goals which were actually being discussed at the COP29 which has been concluded recently at the Baku, Azerbaijan, and what can be the way forward that India can actually take from here in the direction of climate change mitigation, which forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of environment conservation. A question shall actually come in your mind that why these conference of parties related to climate change are taking place annually. What is the rationale behind them? So to understand the threat of climate change which is posed upon us, we will take up a case study which has actually come in the today's newspaper itself in the Hindu about the unpredictable rainfall events which are taking place in Marathwada. And we are going to learn about the story of Dada Rao Ghatode, a farmer from the Jalna district of Maharashtra, who actually grows soya bean and cotton on his 8-acre farmland. During the Kharif season which basically prevails from the month of July to October, and he was actually expecting an earning of 80,000 rupees from his crop until an extreme rainfall event actually led to the destruction of 80% of his crop. Several such extreme rainfall events or extreme weather events are actually threatening the livelihood of several such farmers across the country. What do we mean by this extreme rainfall event? So today's article itself defines such extreme rainfall events where the 1 day's rainfall is actually equal to the 99th percentile quantity of the total estimated rainfall for that particular region. And such extreme weather events which are actually being caused by the global warming induced climate change, they are actually kind of altering the global climate, actually threatening the kind of food security which prevails in the region, actually leading to the distress among the farmers, and all these events has been termed by the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as the code red for humanity. Just have a quick look at the data which has been provided to us by the today's article, which actually shows that in this Marathwada region specifically, there is taking place 70% rainfall in the 3 months, 70% of the annual rainfall in the 3 months itself, that is from the July, August and September batch. So for example, the frequency of those days with like 3 mm of rainfall has dropped by 30% in the month of August, which is basically a critical period for the crop growth of such Rabi kind of or Kharif kind of crops. Second is that in September there is 18% more rainy days, which means that the land is waterlogged when the crop is actually approaching towards the harvest. So obviously it is impacting the food security in the region. The idea is that such events are actually going to further intensify because if we refer to the 6th assessment report 2021 by IPCC, it states that world is actually going to breach the Paris Agreement target within the next 2 decades itself. So under the Paris Agreement, which we signed at the COP21 of the UNFCCC, it was decided that the whole collective world, the various countries are actually going to target to limit down the global warming or the increasing temperature across the world up to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of 21st century. But the idea is that the kind of emissions which the countries are doing or the kind of nationally determined contributions which they have set for themselves, we are going to breach this with this very high greenhouse gas emission within the next 2 decades itself. And if such greenhouse gas emission continues, by the year of 2060, the temperature will be crossing 2 degrees Celsius and reaching up to 3.1 degrees Celsius by the end of 21st century. Such increasing global warming will also obviously results in the increase of global mean sea level by 1.3 meter, which can have catastrophic impact across the world, specifically among the small island developing states. And this 1.3 meter rise is up from what level? From the 1995 to 2014 measured level. Thus, if we look at the larger impact of this climate change or the global warming, just kind of look at this graph which has been provided. So the average length of drought, with if the temperature will reach 3 degrees Celsius, will be around 10 months, and 63% probability will be there that there will be an ice-free Arctic summer in any 1 year if the temperature is going to reach there. So first of all, the drought conditions will intensify. Then the ice melting is going to take place. So there is going to be a huge water scarcity as well, which will prevail among the world if the temperature is going to reach to that level. The idea is that is why there is taking place a series of such conference of parties over the years. A kind of a series of conventions. It started from where? From the Earth Summit which took place at Rio in the year of 1992, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was actually put up for signature. So that came into force. And the first such conference of parties under this UNFCCC took place at Berlin in the year of 1995. This was the such 29th conference of parties, where the major idea was to discuss about this new collective quantified goals, where the idea is that the developed nations who are historically responsible for the greenhouse gas emission and the current global warming shall actually finance the climate change transitioning initiatives of the developing nations. So what happened? It actually turned down as a kind of a disappointment for the developing nations, because the developing nations, they were demanding a kind of a climate finance mobilization of $1.3 trillion a year by the year of 2035. In return to which these developed nations, they offer only $300 billion a year. Thus, various countries like India called it a kind of an optical illusion, rejected it, because with such meager financing, these countries will be unable to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement or the kind of the nationally determined contributions which they have set for themselves. And these developed nations are not taking the historical responsibility, even though this global north, as per the Niti Aayog, is responsible for 82% of the carbon budget currently. Just completely unrelated, there is a businessman in our country who runs a very famous company, who is frequently in the news because of the several disputes. That company actually earned a profit of 42,396 crore in the fiscal year of 2024. That actually equals to more than $400 billion. And these developed or rich nations, which are historically responsible for this climate change which is taking place, which can actually lead to a kind of a sixth mass extinction, they are offering a meager amount of $300 billion a year. Now the question arises that is there some rationale behind such demands which are being made by these developing nations? What do they need this financing actually for? The first idea is that finance is a critical component of accelerating the adoption of the cleaner technologies, right? So for example, if we are going to install any kind of renewable energy, there exists a high upfront capital cost of installation, right? So let's say, for example, India actually is putting impetus upon the installation of wind energy plants, a topic which was holistically covered in your analyst dated 11th of November, where we talked about that how to install, let's say, a 2.5 megawatt plant of a wind energy. It is actually require a 5 acre of land and around 800 crore of capital investment. Now just imagine in your mind that how many small island states, let's say for example Vanuatu or Papua New Guinea, is actually capable of financing such hefty projects, that too at a large viable scale, and that too if they require a kind of a long gestation period. So obviously, will they require a kind of a finance by these developed and rich nations to actually fund these projects? The second is the protection of the future green technologies. So many of these developed and rich nations, they are already technologically advanced. They have skilled labor, because of which they are doing what? They are actually producing a lot of future green technologies. Now they are protecting it through what? Through intellectual property regimes or patents. Thus, the idea is that now, as a developing nation, India will further need to purchase these future green technologies from this developed nation itself. It's like basically, I am first of all the cause of disease, and then I am also making sure that I will be the person to provide you the medicine for that, thus making profit in both ways. Third is the high expenditure, which can actually make a kind of a dent on the country's health. So today's article itself highlights that how the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy has actually got the highest budget allocation this year by the government of India, that is 19,100 crore rupees. Or for example, the transport sector has actually got a kind of a subsidy of 5,760 crore rupees this year, specifically for the promotion of the FAME scheme, which is basically related with the faster adoption of the electric vehicle technologies. So the idea is what? The idea is that if the government is going to provide such high allocation, is it not going to impact the fiscal consolidation path on which our finance minister is actually saying that now we will be targeting fiscal consolidation? We will actually bring down our fiscal deficit to around 4.5% of the GDP by the year of 2025, or to actually meet the target of Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act of 2003, which actually directs that the fiscal deficit shall be brought down to 3% of the GDP. Then what these developed countries are doing, that they are offering these developing nations various kind of debt instruments, thus leading to a kind of a debt trap. There are two cases. First is that first of all, if I am taking a debt from this developed nation to actually install green technologies, I am actually doing what? I am limiting the capability of the private sector to actually fund down the mobilization. I will not be do the crowding in effect to them. The second is that if as a developed nation or a small island nation, if I go to this Bretton Woods institution, obviously they offer me higher lending rates, right? So that is another issue. The fourth and the last, the data which has been provided is by the UNCTAD, which says that the nationally determined contributions which has been taken by various island states, developing nations like India, that cumulatively will require the financing of 5.8 to 13.6 trillion dollar by the year of 2030, and at least 2.4 trillion dollar a year from the 2030 onwards. Then in this comparison, just look at the kind of the financing which is being provided to us by this developed nation. Also, there is a very important requirement of these small island developing states, because just look at these data, that how over 3 billion people actually live in the areas that are highly susceptible to such climate risk. There is these small island developing states, they are vulnerable to the impact of climate change because of their specific geographical conditions, like small land masses, example Mauritius, low-lying coastal areas such as for example Tuvalu, remote locations like Seychelles, fragile ecosystems like Marshall Islands, dependence on natural resources itself like for example Solomon Islands, and the pronounced vulnerability to the natural disasters such as for example Antigua or Barbuda. Then if we just specifically look at the numbers, the economic numbers, so 6 out of 10 nations are at the highest risk to climate change and natural disasters worldwide are in these Asia and Pacific island states. Then if you look at Mauritius, if there is no intervention which will take place, it will eventually lead to loss of $100 million in tourism because of the loss of islands by the year of 2060. Then for example, and islands are actually threatened to sink soon, countries like Kiribati are purchasing lands in other countries to relocate their endangered population. So there are several such issues which these small island nations are facing, and the question which arises here is that what is this actually, this new collective quantified goals on the basis of which these developing countries are actually demanding the finance? Does there exist any kind of financial mechanism under this United Nations framework on climate change? The answer is yes. The Article 11 of this convention specifically sets up a kind of a financial mechanism which is actually entrusted under the Global Environment Facility, where it basically acts as a fund which is actually substituted by the donation of various developed nations, and then this Global Environment Facility actually funds the sustainable initiatives in the developing nations. Remember that this GF also serves as a financial mechanism for the following convention beside UNFCCC, and that is your Convention on Biological Diversity, your UNCCD, that is Combat to Desertification, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and the Minamata Convention on Mercury as well. Then in the COP3, that was in 1997, we signed up a Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol, which was basically targeting to just reduce down the greenhouse gases, which was responsible for the global warming, and it led to the adaptation or the establishment of a kind of an adaptation fund. Then the COP16 at Cancun, there was a standing committee on finance which was established, and the idea to actually mobilize $100 billion annually up to the year 2020 given to this developing nation by the developed state was first floated. Then took place your COP19 at Warsaw, right, in the year of 2013, where a kind of a loss and damage fund was created, which actually especially catered to the need of low income countries and the small island developing states. The idea was that these states, which are actually getting impacted from the climate change induced events, such as, for example, let's say the intensification of tropical cyclone, so there will be a kind of a fund through which they can actually be compensated for the kind of economic and non-economic losses which they are facing because of climate change. Then finally came your Paris Agreement, the Article 9 of which specifically provided for this new collective quantified goal, where it is stated that there will be $100 billion annual mobilization by the Annex 1 countries or the developed nations to these developing states. Remember that till now this $100 billion mobilization, a staggering amount, has been met only once, and that was in the year of 2022. What are the reasons? What are the challenges? Why there are so many roadblocks ahead when it comes to financing? First is to actually determine that which is the country or the countries that are actually going to pay for this. So for example, whenever we are saying repeatedly the developed nation shall pay, the developed nation shall pay, what we actually mean by these developed nation? So when the Rio summit is taking place, or the Earth summit is taking place at 1992, when the developed nations were bought into the Annexer 1, that these are the nations who are actually going to fund the kind of climate change mitigation initiatives in the developing nation, it basically meant the original 24 countries which were part of the OECD. Now, these developed nations, what they claim is that if we look at the current greenhouse gas emission which is being done, who is the second biggest emitter in the world? So that is what? That is China. So now the US can actually claim as a kind of a developing nation or a developed nation that China, who is the second biggest emitter and is kind of rising in terms of economy, is still claims to be a kind of a developing country, and thus actually does not fall in the Annexer 1, rather in the Annexer 2 of the agreement. However, if you look at China from the terms of per capita generation, its ranking will actually stands at 20th. So who are the 6 biggest emitter when it comes to the per capita generation? They are basically the 6 Middle East countries. Again, they also fall in the Annexer 2 and not in the Annexer 1 or in the donation term. But the idea is that these are very geographically small countries, so their overall contribution is actually very less. The idea is basically that there is a kind of a conflict which exists when it comes to the determination that which country is actually going to pay. The third issue is actually the determination of a kind of a time frame that shall be actually fixed at 10 years or 15 years of funding. So for example, right now these developing nations were demanding funding till 2035, and that has been rejected. The next issue is obviously the kind of a historical responsibility which is not being shared by these developed nations, versus they are emphasizing upon the current accountability or the current greenhouse gas emission. Remember that India, in the terms of a single individual country, is the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide. Thus, what these developed nations, such as for example Vanuatu, has done, that they are kind of trying to enforce a legal treaty, a legal obligation on these treaties to provide such financial mechanisms, and for that purpose they have actually approached the International Court of Justice, colloquially called as the World's Court. Let's try to understand what is International Court of Justice. So it is basically only international organizations which adjudicate the general disputes between the nation, and it is located where? At the Hague, Netherlands. Thus, it is the only out of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations which is not located in the New York. And it is basically kind of carrying forward, it acts as a successor or carrying the legacy of the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which was actually established by the League of Nations through the Treaty of Versailles following the event of the First World War in the year of 1920. It consists basically of what? A panel of 15 judges who actually are selected by United Nations Security Council and UNGA. These 15 judges who are actually selected for the terms of 9 years, and none of them can actually come from the same nationality. There are only two official languages being English and French. And the Article 59 says that any ruling by the International Court of Justice will be binding on the parties. So if it rules in the favor of Vanuatu, the idea is that whether it will be kind of binding on the developed nations or not, let's try to assess that. So the idea is that when we are saying binding, it basically implies that the states are agreeing to submit to the ruling of the state. At the same time, there takes place a kind of exclusion of non-state members like NGOs, and also they are not involved in this kind of a legally binding treaties. And this agreement is basically then comprising what? A kind of a dispute resolution mechanism where exists a kind of a compromise between the disputed countries. So let's say, for example, the Kulbhushan Jadhav case, where he was actually termed as a kind of a spy by the Pakistan government and given capital punishment or execution. So India did what? It actually appealed to the International Court of Justice, and that stalled the capital execution. Or for example, let's say the case of Russia-Ukraine ongoing war, where Ukraine actually alleged Russia to kind of violating the 1948 Genocide Convention. And there was a 13:2 majority ruling which actually directed Russia by ICJ to stop the war immediately. Surprise, surprise, the war is still going on. That basically means what? That there is no such legal binding which can be applied to this developed nation. So what can be the takeaway which India shall take from this failure of new quantified collective goals at COP29? The first is that we shall focus upon the localization of our sustainable development goals, to actually localize it up to the level of panchayats and municipalities to actually work in the direction of climate change mitigation. Second is that we have emerged as a voice of Global South. Thus, we need to stand for them at various international platforms, just like how we did at G20. The third is that there shall be stronger commitment to our nationally determined contributions or our Panch Amrit targets, which we took at COP26 at Glasgow. Just have a quick read of that. Then there shall be further such initiatives in the direction of other renewable energies like PM Surya Ghar Yojana, where we are trying to actually install rooftop solar panels. And finally, there shall be much more impetus upon the green mobility and green buildings. So any one of you who have been following the analyst can please comment down about the concept of high performance building, if you guys can recall from the lecture. Also try to attempt this particular question, and we move forward to the next news, where the article actually provides a kind of an insight in the job creation and the achievements which has been achieved under the Government of India's flagship scheme, Production Linked Incentive Scheme, in the last 3 years, which forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of manufacturing sector and the employment generation. Let's first start by understanding what do we mean by the production linked incentive scheme. So in the backdrop of the global supply chain disruptions which was taking place caused because of the Russia-Ukraine war, and then obviously further kind of inflated by the pandemic which took place, at the same time to actually boost the domestic manufacturing and provide impetus on high import substitution, obviously the kind of high import dependence which we had on the products, that can be also reflected from the kind of trade deficit which we share with China. If any one of you can just comment down the data of the current trade deficit which we are having with China, to tackle with all these issues and obviously to create non-farm jobs, the government came up with the production linked incentive scheme, which was launched comprising of 14 sectors with an outlay of 1.97 lakh crore in the year of 2020. The sectors were extended to 14 in the year of 2021. The sectors which comprises such as, for example, electronic manufacturing, or for example, pharmaceutical ingredients, your manufacturing of medical devices, auto components, drugs, specialty steel, telecom and networking products, IT hardware, your white goods like for example, air conditioners and LEDs, the food products, the textile products, solar PV modules, as well as advanced chemistry cell battery, and the drone and drone components as well. The 14 sectors which fall under the PLI scheme. The idea is that what the government is doing, it is trying to actually incentivize the supply side of the production, where it is incentivizing these companies, foreign as well as domestic, based upon the incremental sale of theirs. Let's take an example here. We say that, for example, I am a company. Let's say my company basically name is Power, right? So there is a Power organization. And we are going to denote this company by S. So the idea is what? This particular company produced, let's say for example, 100 products, each product which valued, let's say 10 rupees in the year of 2023. So the total amount came to around 1000 rupees.
In the second year, that is 2024, now the company has produced 200 products and thus the sale has increased to 2000 rupees. So out of this 1000 rupees incremental sale which has been incurred by the company, the government is actually going to provide subsidy which will vary across different sectors. And when the government is going to provide this subsidy, the companies can actually use this for further manufacturing. So it is basically kind of incentivizing a kind of a chain of manufacturing through these companies. Remember that in certain sectors we are also looking at the value addition which has been done in that particular sector, such as for example civil aviation as well. The question which shall come in your mind is, what if the company is producing the same amount of product and then there is inflation? So the company's cost of product has increased. So that will lead to incremental sale? No. We are actually going to look at the number of products, their prices from the base year, and then we'll see what is the incremental sale which has been incurred by the company. Now, what Indian Express did, that it actually asked the information related to this particular scheme under the Right to Information Act of 2005. Under which it is found that the particular scheme, which was kind of being considered as a employment generation dark horse and it is going to generate a lot of non-farm jobs, it has actually created 5.84 lakh jobs out of 16.2 lakh direct jobs which were targeted in the 5 years time period. So let's say the scheme was launched in 2020. The idea was by 2025 we are going to achieve how many jobs? 16.2 lakh direct jobs. But how many we have created? Only 36% of that. And 75% of these direct jobs has been created only in 3 sectors, and that is food, pharma and the mobile phones. Just see the kind of jobs which were created in mobile phones, in pharmaceuticals and then food processing. So obviously mobile phones has actually kind of considered a very staggering growth in that particular area. Now, there are several sectors which are actually lagging behind, such as for example the textile sector, the solar PV modules, the auto components. For example, in the textile sector, only 33% of the targeted jobs creation was actually matched. Then there are several sectors as for example advanced chemistry cell sector, where there exists long gestation period. So there is not enough funds which has been released by the government yet. The projects are taking a lot of time to start. Also, there is a slow rate of adoption which exists of the new technologies, such as for example in the automobile sector, the electric vehicles such as for example, and that is also hampering the job creation in this particular sector. Now let's have another look, the other side of the coin, and that is the government stand. The government stand says that the scheme has actually catalyzed the private investment in the sector because of the kind of the boost it is providing to manufacturing, and it has led to 1.3 lakh crore of investment. The production and sale has actually been around 8.6 lakh crore. And because of this particular impetus which has been provided by the government, the micro, small and medium enterprises has been specifically benefited, as 176 MSMEs stand as the PLI beneficiaries. And that has also led to high amount of import substitution. So our dependency on the imports by the other countries, let's say for example China, has actually drastically declined. Let's say for example in the telecom sector there is a decline of 60% import substitution, right? Also, the investments realized exist at around 1.46 lakh crore. The production value is around 12.5 lakh crore as of August 2024. 9.5 lakh job has been created. Now remember, it is including direct as well as indirect. And the export is around, from because of these 14 key sectors, because of PLI, is stand around 4 lakh crore. But when it comes to the kind of the report which has been published by the Indian Express, the question which we shall ask ourselves is that what are the challenges which are being faced by this production linked incentive scheme? First is obviously the issue with the idea itself, because the scheme is saying that we are going to incentivize the supply side. So let's say for example, if I am a producer coming from the company Power S, and now I would like to produce as much as I want, or as much as being incentivized by the government, but I would like to do that only if there exists a demand as well. If we are looking at the kind of the data which was provided to us by the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey of 2023-2024, it is telling that, let's say for example, the average monthly per capita expenditure in your rural area, 46% of that went to food. Or in urban area, 39% of that went into the food.
So obviously, let's say if 46% of the income of a particular person is going in that direction, there does not exist a huge demand for such manufacturing goods. And if there will not exist the demand, for whom I will be actually be producing, even though there exists a kind of a incentivization by the government. So the scheme completely does not focus upon the demand side of it, right? Second is, India is obviously a kind of a price sensitive market. So let's say, for example, if we are putting impetus upon advanced chemistry cell, considering the long gestation period and the technology adoption or automation which is required, if the cost is high, obviously the demand will be low for that particular product. Third is the less profitability which various foreign companies has faced. So they have kind of joined, like kind of started production in our country, and then they have kind of moved back. The reason for that is the less profitability, and that is coming from the impetus upon the adoption of green models or corporate social responsibility, which obviously reduce down their profitability. Then there exists a kind of a shortage of skilled workers. So let's say, for example, the government is incentivizing the advanced chemistry cell industry, and for this particular industry we require a specific workers of a specific skill set. But if you do not have that skill set, anyway the job is not going to be created. That exactly what leads to the frictional unemployment which exists. Just look at the countries facing the greatest skill shortage. India stands there with 64% of the people who are not adequately skilled enough for the requirements of industry 4.0. Then how the jobs will be created? Then there is obviously the kind of a less incentive by the government for specific sectors. Just for example, if you look at the mobile hardware and the kind of electronic sector which exists, so the actual realization of the funding by the government, that has been meager. Just look at for the white goods, such as for example, or for the auto components. So there exists a kind of a budget allocation, and the PLI scheme actually reflect the slow progress in many sectors. Then second is the issue of incentive calculation, that how we are actually going to calculate the incentive, because it varies from different sectors to sector. There can be various ways of calculating the incremental sales, so that becomes a problem. And the long gestation period of various projects is also acting as a kind of a detriment to the job creation at a short scale level. So how we are going to tackle these challenges? There are several steps which has been taken by the government of India. First of all, the patent regime under the Patent Rules 2024 has been further simplified. So actually the people have been provided with a lot of more access to various kind of intellectual property regime protected technologies. Second is the government is actually trying to enhance the quality of the product under the zero defect, zero effect policy. To further increase the exports which we are doing, the country is signing various kind of free trade agreements, for example with Australia or United Arab Emirates. Then for skilling of the worker, we are actually have launched the Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0, or actually to promote the startups we have launched Fund of Funds. Then we are further promoting the research at the state university level under the Anusandhan National Research Foundation. And to further provide the employment, the government has also launched the employment linked incentive scheme under your budget 2024, where the government is saying that now it is also going to share a kind of your first salary's burden, where the certain kind of amount from your first salary will be provided through the exchequer of the government. So these are the steps which the government is taking to boost the improvement, to boost the kind of employment, boost the manufacturing, boost the demand as well, because obviously if the employment will increase, it will create a cycle of demand, and that cycle of demand will obviously increase the production as well. So keep this kind of debates in your mind, try to answer this particular question, and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to learn about the history of a very important organization which has been repeatedly in the news, and that is Shiromani Akali Dal. To understand the story, let's first try to understand the context of the news, where the Akal Takht has actually announced a kind of a religious punishment called as Tankha for the Shiromani Akali Dal leader Sukhbir Singh Badal. For what? For the kind of misgovernment which he did when he was in the power from 2007 to 2017. So this basically also marks a kind of a case of religious intrusion in the political sphere or the governing sphere. Then there also exists a kind of a dispute where the Shiromani Guru Dwara Parbandhak Committee and the Akal Takht actually kind of contest for the position of the Jothedar, which is basically considered as the one of the highest position in the Sikhism, right? Or kind of a person who speaks on the behalf of Sikhism. And that is a kind of a disputed position between the SGPC and the Akali Takht.
You guys can see here the Shiromani Akali Dal President Sukhbir Singh Badal sits by the gate at the Golden Temple in Amritsar, which marks the first Akali Takht, with a plaque around his neck and spear in his hand as one of the religious punishment kind of pronounced by the Sri Akal Takht Sahib. To understand this, let's have a first quick look of the establishment of Sikhism as a religion of philanthropy by the great Guru Nanak, who lived from 1469 to 1539. Can anyone tell me, was he contemporary of Mughal ruler Akbar or not? Now, obviously, when he's starting Sikhism, there is a kind of religious syncretic ideas which he's deriving from both Bhakti tradition of Kabir, Ramanand, as well as the Sufi tradition, such as for example the Wajhat ul Wajud, which basically stands for that the creator is one. From that, he actually will embark upon the various kind of udasiyan or the religious pursuits, the places which are marked here. And through that, he will actually propagate the idea of Ek Onkar, or the God is one. He will also establish two important institutions. The first was the Sangat, or a kind of a social congregation for chanting the name of the God, and the Pangat, that was basically the langar to provide free food to the various poor people of that particular time. However, over a period of time, we'll just do a kind of a fast forward in the history where various kind of social evils will actually creep in the religion of Sikhism, such as for example the institution of caste, the discrimination of the lower caste people, the practice of child marriage, etc. So there were various reform movements which were actually taken place in the 19th century related to Sikhism. First in the kind of series was Nirankari movement, which was actually launched by Baba Dayal Das, who is also considered as the first reformer of the Sikh religion, who was contemporary of whom? The great Sikh ruler Ranjit Singh. He basically kind of disapproved the worshipping of tombs and graves which had started, and also the kind of various luxury weddings which was taking place at that time, where the people were kind of actually very freely indulging in the practice of dowry or drinking intoxicating liquor, etc. Thus, he actually introduced the practice of Anand Karaj, or the simplified version of marriage, which was also legalized through the British Act of Anand Marriage Act of 1909. Then it was launched a kind of a Namdhari movement, which is also called as a Kuka movement. Why so? Because the followers, they actually used to resort a kind of a shrek or kuka when they actually used to go in the kind of state of trance or ecstasy while they were reciting Gurbani. This was basically launched by Bhagwat Jawahar Mal and Baba Balak Singh against various kind of social practices, such as for example the caste discrimination, the worshipping of idol, or for example exchanging of daughters as a kind of a barter system for the marriages. So against all these social evils, the Namdhari movement was launched. During the very same time, the second Anglo-Sikh war will take place. You guys can correct it actually, leading to the annexation of Punjab. And after that, the Sikhs, they actually kind of realize that there are certain issues which are prevailing in their religion itself, and they try to purify it. Thus, they kind of started putting impetus upon wearing Indian or indigenous cloth, following Indian education system. So you guys can say that basically this Namdhari or Kuka movement acted as a kind of a precursor to the Swadeshi movement of 1905. Then when this Kuka movement was actually suppressed in the year of 1873, there arose a kind of a Singh Sabha movement, where now the idea was that the Sikhs actually shall indulge themselves into the modern education, is basically the vernacular education. So that became a kind of a ground for socio-religious reforms, leading to the establishment of various kind of Khalsa College, one of the prominent being the Khalsa College at Amritsar, 1892, established by the efforts of Lala Lajpat Rai. And that was actually considered by the Britishers as the ground or a fertile ground for the nationalism in our country. So there were various moments which was taking place in the 19th century, and the series of that actually also followed with the kind of a Gurudwara reform movement, also called as Akali movement. So what happened, that there were various kind of pujaris or udasi mahants who took the control of these gurudwaras, the places of philanthropy. And then the kind of jagirs which they were getting, let's say for example from the kings, they actually started getting wealthier. So over a period of time, obviously the corruption creeps in. So they started converting these places which were actually held for the religious practices into their kind of personal jagirs or personal property. And they also started selling them or indulging them into the various kind of activities. The kind of idol worshipping started, even though they professed to the Sikhism. So considering all these issues, the turning point comes with your non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 22. One of the backdrop of the event is what?
the kind of passing of the Rowlatt Act, against which the Gandhi will launch what? The Rowlatt Satyagraha. That will lead to the arrest of Saifuddin and Kichlu on 9th of April 1990, ultimately leading to what? The Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which took place on 13th April 1990. For whom the responsible is whom? The General Dyer. And this General Dyer will be actually held or kind of a bit appreciated by these Udasis Mahant of Gurudwaras, and thus that will obviously infuriate the Sikhs further, leading to kind of these Akali Jathas who will lead the movement on 12th of October 1920. You guys can see the Khalsa Birdari Society, which is occupying the premises of Akal Takht after purging these Pujari caretakers or Udasi Mahants, thus marking the beginning of Akali movement on this particular day, thus leading to the formation of a 25-member committee, that is Shiromani Gurudwara Prabandhak Committee, SGPC. And this SGPC's task force to actually implement the kind of reforms it was seeking, that was your Shiromani Akali Dal, leading to the formation of Shiromani Akali Dal. And this activity was actually recognized by the Britishers under the Gurudwara Reform Act of 1925. The Shiromani Akali Dal over a period of time will actually emerge as a kind of a political party. Thus, in the elections which took place in 1937 under the Government of India Act 1935, it will actually win kind of 10 seats there as well. There was very important leader called as Tara Singh. Tara Singh and Akali Dal were completely against the partition of India which took place. After that, the same party will actually launch the Punjabi Suba movement, which will actually lead to the creation of Punjab as a separate state in the year of 1966. The idea is that what is this Akal Takht then? So Akal Takht was actually formed as one of the 5 major seats of power of Sikhism in India, the first of which was established at Harminder Sahib or at the Golden Temple which exists at Amritsar by the 6th Sikh Guru, Guru Har Gobind in 1609, whose father was actually killed by the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, right? So that is why he was the first one to actually establish a kind of a military organization called as Akal Sena, created the practice of military training or the martial art which you guys learn about, that is Gatka. And all of these efforts actually showcases the results in the Battle of Amritsar 1634, where he will kind of defeat the Mughal power. And he was the one who actually introduced the concept of Miri Piri. Miri Piri basically means that from now onwards, the Sikhs are not only going to focus upon the spirituality aspect, but they will also kind of demand for the political power as well. So remember Shiromani Akali Dal, remember Guru Har Gobind, remember this kind of dispute between Akal Takht and SAD which is taking place and featuring in the news. We move forward to the next news, where on the World Wildlife Conservation Day, which is actually celebrated on 4th of December today, we are actually going to learn about the statistics, very important statistics related to wildlife in our country. First, let's try to have a quick look about this World Wildlife Conservation Day, which is actually celebrated on 4th of December. The reason for that is because the Endangered Species Conservation Act 1969 was passed by the US President Richard Nixon on the very same date. That is why there was a kind of a pledge by US State Department to the United Nations to declare this day as the World Wildlife Conservation Day. The theme for this year is connecting people and planet and exploring the digital innovations in wildlife conservation. First such day was celebrated in the year of 2012, and remember that the World Wildlife Day is actually celebrated on 3rd of March. Now, what does the article tells us about? It tells us that even though as a country we possess only 2.4% of the world's land area, we actually accounts for 7 to 8% of all recorded species in the world, with India having 45,000 species of plants and 91,000 of animals, thus making our country the 8th most biodiverse region in the world. And out of this total population which we have, 8.5% of them are mammals, 13.6% of them are avians, 7.9 are reptiles, 4.6 being amphibians, 11.7% being the fishes, and the 11.8% are the plants. How UPSC can actually ask a question from this data? It will ask you eventually that, let's say for example, the population of plants or fauna in our country are more than the population of fishes, and that is true. Then remember that out of this species which we have currently 172 threatened species in our country. Also, we have 1014 protected areas, out of which there are 106 national parks which constitutes around 2% of the total country's land area. Can anyone tell me that as per the Indian State of Forest Report 2023, what is the percentage of area which is currently under the forest in our country? Then, as per the today's article, India is actually going to become a global hotspot for human-animal conflict by the year of 2070. Remember that when we are talking about being such a mega diverse country in the terms of flora and fauna, India has 4 out of the 34 biodiversity hotspots which exist in the world. Which are those 4 areas? First is obviously the Western Ghat or the Great Escarpment of India. Then there is Sri Lanka. Indo-Burma region is there, Himalaya is there, so Sri Lanka and Western Ghats forms one part, and Sunda land is here as well, which basically comprises the area of Andaman and Nicobar. So we have 4 areas out of 34 biodiversity hotspots. However, the article today highlights that how there exists a kind of a risk of extinction of this mega diverse flora and fauna species which we have. One of the major reasons for that is the increasing human-animal conflict which is taking place. Such as, for example, just look at the elephants which are being killed by, for example, coming in the front of train, or because of electrocution, or for example the poaching or the poisoning, as well as the humans which has been killed by elephant. Similarly, the kill by tigers, the various kind of poaching deaths which are occurring for tigers as well, or for example because of the poisoning which was recently done in one of the national parks in our country. So there is an increasing human-animal conflict. Major reason for that is 2.4% of the land surface area of the world, increasing anthropogenic activities, search for natural reserves, increasing habitation area as well, and unsustainable population. So obviously human-animal conflict will further rise, that is for sure. Then the article suggests that how there exists a kind of a critically endangered species which exists in our country as per the IUCN list, that has increased from being 47 in 2011 to 73 in 2024. And 8 out of 9 critically endangered mammals in our country are endemic. Name of that has been given. Please note them down. That is your Kashmiri stag or hangul. Then there is your Andaman shrew, Jenkins shrew and Nicobar shrew. Then there is Malabar large spotted civet, Namdapha flying squirrel, large rock rat, and the leaf-lidded leaf-nosed bat as well. Obviously, we know about the tigers being in the endangered list, the elephants being in the endangered list. So obviously these are the kind of the very prominent keystone species which are listed there in this endangered list. At the same time, we also might have heard about the critically endangered great Indian bustard, who are actually being killed because of the kind of collusion they are having with the electric lines in the region of your Rajasthan and Gujarat. So all of these issues are actually acting as a kind of a detriment to the population of flora and fauna. Thus, India has come up with a Wildlife Protection Act of 2022, where we have actually trying to align ourselves further with the CITES Treaty, which actually deals with the kind of trade with the endangered species, right? Under that, from earlier WPA 1972, now we have transformed to the 4 important schedules. The Schedule 1 provides for the highest level of protection, which is provided to whom? To black buck, Asiatic wild dog dhole, the family of cats which includes your cheetah, lion, tiger, clouded leopard, snow leopard, etc. Then there are various kind of deer such as, for example, musk, hawk, Kashmiri hangul, Barasingha. So obviously all the critically endangered species, they are put where in your Schedule 1, such as for example black and blue corals as well. Remember, one species of deer actually features in the Schedule 2, and that is spotted deer. Then there is your nilgai, flying fox, Indian hedgehog, Andaman and Nicobar rat, or the greater and lesser flamingo, which actually features in the Schedule 2. In Schedule 3, we have got plants. Which are the plants? Blue and red vanda, pitcher plant, Neel Kurinji, Mishmi Tista, and your tree turmeric. Then there is Schedule 4, which basically specifically deals with those species which are featured in the CITES list, such as for example your Vicugna or camel, brother of Virat Kohli, that is Acus kohli, that is deer, Canis lupus, that is wolf, and Urus actos, that is brown bear. So just note down this or take a screenshot. We move forward to the next news, where we are actually going to compare the pardoning power. The pardoning power which is actually provided to the head of our state, and that is president, with the pardoning power which is actually provided to the president of United States of America. And what is the context of it? So recently the US President Joe Biden has granted the going US President an unconditional pardon to his son Hunter Biden, who was actually facing sentences for various kind of federal taxes and gun conviction. The question arises that can the US President pardon anyone? So first of all, what is the idea of providing this pardoning power to the head of states, how it has been provided to United States of America and India? The idea is the royal prerogative of mercy, the kind of a historical prerogative of the British monarch to actually grant the pardons to the convicted person. Originally, it was used to be by monarch to withdraw or provide alternative to the death sentences. Now, under the US president, the US constitution, can the president grant pardon in all cases? The answer is yes, but there is an exception. Note that down. And that exception is that in the case of impeachment, the pardoning cannot be provided. All the other cases, the US president has the absolute power of pardon for federal criminal offenses. The pardon such can be also issued even prior to the start of legal case. So before there is some legal case which is going to be launched against me, before that only, if my father is president, lucky for me, I will be pardoned. Or for example, I can get pardon prior to or after the conviction of crime as well. So even before the conviction of crime, can I be pardoned? Yes. Is these two things applicable in our case? No. Right? So in our case, only when the sentence has been done, only when you are convicted of any crime, only then the pardoning is provided, not before that. Then there can be also the grant relief from punishment and associated disqualification. The US president can do that, but not erase the conviction record, remember. Now we move to the Indian president, whose pardoning power is actually provided under Article 72. Where such punishment or sentence, so in what cases actually the president can provide these pardons? So first of all, if the punishment or sentence is for an offense which is against a union law. Second, the punishment or sentence is by a military court, so there is a kind of a court martial. Third, if there is any capital punishment, even in the case of state government as well. So remember that if it comes to the pardoning of a death sentence, of a capital punishment, that can only be done by the president. It cannot be done by the governor of the state. Then remember that it is not a judicial power of the president, rather it is an executive power, and thus the president does not sit as a court of appeal. The idea basically is to provide this power to the president, as argued by the B.R. Ambedkar in the court, in the Constituent Assembly, that is to correct any judicial error which can occur in the operation of the law. Now, the Supreme Court has held what? It has held the in your Epuru Sudhakar case 2006 that any such pardoning which is being provided by the president, that is actually subject to the judicial review. So in our Indian constitution, what happens? There is two articles, Article 72 which provides for the pardoning power of the president, and Article 161 which provides for the pardoning power of the governor. There are 5 such pardoning power which has been provided, and that is what? Pardon, commutation, remission, respite or reprieve, which can be exercised as per the article on the advice of the Council of Ministers, correct? Any such pardoning which is provided by the president actually absolves the offender from conviction, punishment and all associated disqualification. But remember, only the convicted, not before that, right? In the case of US president. Let's quickly understand these 5 types of pardoning power which is provided. Pardoning basically means that I am completely forgiving you, right? That is, guilty will be considered as he had never committed that crime itself. Second is commutation. Commutation is basically what? That I am substituting one form of punishment to a lighter punishment. So for example, if you were kind of having a 20-year terms in the jail, now I will say that okay, you will be there for only 10 years. Then there comes remission. Remission basically implies reducing the period of the sentence. For example, let's say from 20 years of the jail, I am saying now you will be committing to the 10 years. So basically that is decreasing the mission's length. Then comes your respite. That is what? A kind of a spatial fact, right? So this respite is basically provided that if you are, let's say for example, a person with a disability, or for example, you are a pregnant person. So in all these cases, a kind of a respite is provided. Then comes your reprieve, which is basically nothing but a stay for a temporary period. So let's say for example, to get more time, to have one more appeal to the president or to the court, that basically falls in the category of reprieve. So remember these 5 types of pardoning power, and we move forward to the next news, where we are actually going to learn about a very grave tragedy which occurred in our nation called as Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984. First, let's understand about this particular tragedy, which actually occurred in a company called as Union Carbide India Limited, which was built a plant in Bhopal in the late 1960s to actually manufacture an insecticide which was methyl isocyanate,
with one naphthol. So reaction of that, an insecticide was being produced. MIC is a very highly toxic compound, the leakage of which actually caused the deaths, and it reacts with water at a very high temperature, and its reaction with water also releases heat. So on the night of 2nd December 1984, the fateful night, what happens? That a large quantity of water entered a tank storing MIC at the plant, such that MIC soon starts boiling. And instead of diverting the kind of facilities who were there in the plant, they leave MIC vapors to escape to the environment and spread through the settlements around the plant, which eventually led to the death of 3,787 people. However, the activists claim that 25,000 people have been died and 1 lakh people are still suffering from the different sickness. So what was the responsibility? The Indian government argues the slack management of the deferred maintenance caused by the disaster. Then plant owner, the US firm, actually blamed the kind of a sabotage has taken place. Then the UCC chairman, right, Warren Anderson, who left India soon after the disaster, was sought by the Indian government, which had called for his extradition from the US. However, he is dead now. Now there was a kind of a compensation of $470 million which was actually provided by the UCC to the Indian government. So this is the backdrop. The idea is that there are certain heavy metals which are actually leached to the environment, such as for example chromium, copper, lead, mercury and nickel, which are actually classified as these heavy metals. Released from what? Industries, transportation, residential, mines, agriculture, etc. So now there, let's say for example, there is a gas, liquid and solid discharge that can lead to kind of rise as a gas or dust in the air and can come in the form of rain and pollute the water. Or a solid waste can lead to direct contamination, leading to soil pollution or irrigation pollution as well. So that will affect the crop productivity, affect the soil health. Over a period of time, bioaccumulation of these inorganic pollutants can take place. If it can convert into organic pollutants, it can lead to biodegradation as well. So they will kind of have an impact on what flora and fauna as well as human health. Now, why these metals are actually classified as the heavy metals? The reason for that is because their density is at least 5 times that of water, right? And such heavy metals like mercury, or for example, if you look at the research by International Agency for Research on Cancer, there exists sufficient evidence that such mercury or for example arsenic, they are causing cancer of urinary bladder as well as the lungs as well. So there are various diseases which are caused by heavy metals, such as for example Minamata caused by mercury, remember the Minamata convention, Itai disease caused by cadmium, anemia caused by lead, or for example dermatitis and neurotoxicity caused by nickel. These heavy metals are responsible for what? Neurotoxicity, genotoxicity, reproductive and development toxicity, immunological toxicity or your cardiovascular toxicity as well, leading to carcinogenicity as well as nephrotoxicity. So remember about these heavy metals, what are the diseases they are causing. Remember the date of Bhopal gas tragedy as well as the particular leakage of the gas which was responsible, and that was methyl isocyanate. We move forward to the last news of the day, where we are actually going to read about what does the Constitution of India or the law of India actually talks about right to die. A very interesting concept, so hold on with me. The idea is the UK House of Commons has actually passed a bill called as Terminally Ill Adults Bill or End of Life Bill. If enacted, it will actually do what? It will allow the patients with terminal illness to request assistance to end their own life. That basically means when someone can end their own life with a doctor's assistance. It is not as same as euthanasia, in which a doctor has a more active involvement in ending the life of a terminally ill patient. Currently, remember that UK does not permit any type of assisted dying or euthanasia, with the offense of assisted suicide punishable with up to 14 years in prison. So euthanasia is not provided currently under the UK law. Now they are considering it under this, for example, your end of life bill. The idea is that the critics actually say that such a law allowing assisted dying would be prone to misuse, especially when it comes to patient with disability. So for example, let's say if I have a disability that I cannot speak, and then there is a family of me who is actually conspiring, let's say for example, some property of mine, even if I don't own one, and they just want that, and they tell the doctor to actually perform a kind of a euthanasia on me or assisted dying on me, and I cannot speak. So obviously that can become a kind of a very negative impact on my life because it will not exist anymore. The idea is what? The critics raises the concern that such a law might be used to coerce vulnerable persons, so for example, elderly, person with disabilities like me, into signing off their own death. And lawmakers should focus on improving the end of life care instead. So what is the situation in our country? In 2018, the Supreme Court of India actually held that the right to die with dignity formed a part of the right to life with dignity under Article 21 of the Constitution and recognized the legality of, remember, passive euthanasia. What is passive euthanasia? Passive euthanasia basically means withdrawal of life support from terminally ill patients or patients in a person who is kind of in a vegetative state. So it means that they are alive, but still they are not alive in that particular condition, right? So the Supreme Court has actually provided a kind of a guideline, both for cases when the family of a patient actually give the consent to passive euthanasia, or when the patient themselves leave behind a kind of a living will, authorizing the withdrawal of such life support. The guidelines include what? The need for multiple approvals from a local physician, qualified medical boards and local administration. Living wills must be signed in the presence of two witnesses and signed by a judicial magistrate then. So at least I am safe from my relatives. But the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine has said that it has filed an application for further modification on these laws. Remember, only passive euthanasia is legalized in our country and India does not legally permit assisted dying or active euthanasia, how it is being considered in UK. So with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.